This is episode 87 of the Death to Tyrants podcast.
The crushing weight of the tyrant's passage had left nothing unmarked.
You get split in fucking half, but I call him the hologram graph. But I am the center inside the placenta of math. You clash with cyanide gas and die fast. Rhythmical equivalent of solids, liquids, and gas. We smash your sinus with the power of Lord Titus. But I am the virus inside of the iris of Cyrus.
What is up, people? Welcome back once again to the Death to Tyrants podcast. As always, I am your host and humble narrator, Buck Johnson, coming to you out of Austin, Texas. Texas, that's right, where we were once our own country, republic, if you will. And why do I say that now? Because we're talking about secession today. That's a topic I predict will be a lot more common in the years to come as far as national discussions go. So I've got a great person here to talk about that. It's F.H. Buckley. He just wrote a book here called American Secession and the Looming Threat of a National Breakup. And that's why he's here. I saw an article by him a couple of months ago, and it was on secession. And I thought, whoa, this is cool. Who is this fella? Clicked on his stuff, and long story short, we get in touch. He sends me an advanced copy of the book. I go through it quickly because it's really good. You guys need to get this book. Today, when this episode drops, is January 13th. The official release date is tomorrow. So show Mr. Buckley the Death to Tyrants bump and go to Amazon, type in American Secession by F.H. Buckley, and buy this book. It's a quick, easy read, and it covers so many aspects of secession. So do you really think, if you're listening to this podcast and you're right-leaning or libertarian or even left-leaning, is it really the way to go that maybe sometime in the future, 51% of the country will vote against the people I hate? Is that really the way forward? Does one man or one woman in Washington really need to rule over 350 million people? Do you guys like giant monopolies? Do you want AT&T or Time Warner to run all the communications in the entire country? Does that sound good, or would you like, I don't know, hundreds of smaller companies to compete for your business and do things closer to home, local rule? Does that sound like a better option? Well, if so, you got to bust this thing up at some point. The antitrust laws need to come for the United States federal government. And I'm thinking down the road that's something we will see. So that's what we're talking about today, secession. And I love this topic. Let me tell you about my guest. Frank Buckley is a foundation professor at George Mason University's Scalia School of Law. He is a frequent media guest and has appeared on Morning Joe, CNN, Rush Limbaugh, C-SPAN's Washington Journal, China's CGTN, Newsmax, Radio France, the CBC, NPR, and many others. He is a senior editor at the American Spectator, a contributing editor to the Dorchester Review, and a columnist for the New York Post. He has written for the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, USA Today, U.S. News, National Review, the American Conservative, the New Criterion, Real Clear Politics, the National Post, the Telegraph, amongst many others. What an intro. However, after all of those highly acclaimed accolades, he's here on Death to Tyrants. F.H. Buckley, welcome to the show.
Well, I'm delighted to be with you. Call me Frank, by the way.
I will do that. You got it. And so this episode drops Monday, January 13th. I believe it's the day before the official release date of your new book, American Secession. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah.
Well, then I'll start off by saying I've read it already, and it's excellent. I enjoyed it. It covers so many aspects of the topic of secession, basically. And I want to get into all of that with you. Before we chat about that, can you talk about what you do and your background in politics and writing?
Sure. I'm a newly minted American. I became a citizen in 2014. And before that, I taught in Canada and in France. And right now, I'm teaching at George Mason University's law school, which is called the Scalia School of Law. I got involved in American politics in 2016, where I wrote speeches for Donald Trump, along with my wife, and got swept up by the campaign. I thought this was exactly the kind of game changer we had needed. I mean, I had seen a crushing liberal media consensus as to what we were all about, which I thought was completely false and destructive. And you needed a Trump to say no. And so that's what it's been like for the last couple of years, and that's why we're in something like a civil war.
Is the topic of American secession something that you had been thinking about for a while? Or I guess, what inspired you to write this particular book?
I went to a conference which talked about the writings of James Madison. And I got into a discussion about bigness and badness. And I concluded that as a country, we're just too darn big. I mean, it's made us more sclerotic. It's made us impossible to govern. And, it produces the gridlock where equal and opposite sides oppose each other and nothing gets done. And I didn't see any way out except for a breakup of the country of some kind. And then I decided to look at that. I mean, everybody seems to think, well, that can't happen. Like we put pay to that in 1865. But we didn't. And constitutionally, I'm a lawyer after all. So constitutionally, it seemed to me quite possible for a state to secede. And so I wrote a roadmap as to how that could happen.
I don't want to give away the ending, so to speak, but I think it's important to note this. You're not necessarily a full-on proponent of secession. Did I get that correct?
Yeah, you did. I mean, in fact, I'm more of a unionist. If only we could lower the temperature a little bit. I don't see that happening. In the end, what I recommended was something in between. And something in between would amount to a huge devolution of power back to the states. When we got going as a country, this was not a country dominated by the federal government. It was a state-run union, and that's what it was in 1861, and that's what the framers thought. And that, I think, would be the best solution to anything that might happen.
Yeah, and you just kind of touched upon it. I think when the average person on the street, even today, when they hear the term secession, if they know anything about it, they relate it immediately to the southern states in 1860, 61, and so on. But you do a nice job here in the beginning of your book mentioning that, but that was a long time ago. And at this point, it might be more appropriate to think of a state like California, right, or a more progressive-leaning state being among the first to leave. Talk about the secession becoming what you call politically correct now.
Absolutely. Well, imagine an easily imaginable future in which Donald Trump wins re-election in 2020 and gets to appoint a couple of new judges to the Supreme Court. And the judges in question are people where, to quote a leading Democrat, the faith lives loudly in them. And so all of a sudden, things we thought were completely established, like Roe v. Wade, they're up for grabs again. And if that happened, the left would go nuts. You see, the reason for the nonsense, the craziness of the last couple of years has been we're involved in something like a religious war of the irreligious, right? The left had largely forgotten God, but invested everything in worldly politics. And that was their religion.
Yes.
And their religion is really threatened right now, right? I mean, all the things they thought that were completely sacrosanct, were up for grabs. And they responded by doubling down. I mean, what you're hearing from the left is so much more radical than anything you heard a couple of years back, right? I mean, we've got a cancel culture where the statues are coming down, right? Where university people, conservatives in universities, keep their mouth shut. Where the left is tolerant of Antifa violence, right? I mean, anything goes basically if you're on the left. There are no enemies to the left of any kind, right? And so they've doubled down. And then imagine if they figure, oh my God, we've got another 4 or more years of all of this stuff, right? I mean, I think at that point, people in places like California are going to start thinking about getting out of it. And already, you have moves towards that in states that are simply ignoring federal law, right? It's called interposition. It's something invented by James Madison, right? Where you just ignore what's going on. And to a lesser extent, we're seeing that all over the country. We've got an interposition moment going on here in my Virginia.
Mm-hmm.
The governor, who is trying to repent for his blackface photographs, is veering very much to the left with that respect to things like the statues and guns and gun control. And there are about 90% of Virginia's counties that have declared themselves sanctuary counties with respect to enforcing projected gun laws. They're just not going to enforce them. Right. So, I mean, actually, if we could have a secession in Virginia, I think, most people, a majority of people might well go for it just by way of getting rid of Northern Virginia, which is where I live. So, tune up, it's crazy now. It's easy to imagine the dial being turned up, and then what you might get is what I got, a realization that some form of secession is possible. We never thought it was because we never much thought about it, right? And now you ask yourself, well, what's holding the country together? I mean, it used to be that we took pride in our heritage, for example, but the left has been embarked in a crusade to erase that heritage. I mean, here in my Alexandria, Virginia, there's a church, the oldest church around, built by monies contributed in part by George Washington. They had portraits of Robert E. Lee and George Washington in it. Both were congregants here. And they took down both portraits, not just Lee, but Washington as well. So, And then they got a sign outside, one of those signs that says "All welcome here," which I guess doesn't include George Washington.
Right. Wow. Yeah, and I think that's something we've seen. It's almost like when Trump got elected, it kind of mowed down the grass, so everything, all the snakes and the bugs and everything was, you could see it all of a sudden. It's like we were kind of in some mythical bubble for 8 years, and then all of a sudden he comes along and boom, holy,
yep.
You thought the media was bad before. Now they're letting you know exactly who they are, and all of these campus riots and the Antifa stuff. It is fascinating when you're speaking on something like secession. And let me ask you this. Do you think if a progressive state were to be the first to want to secede, that the optics are better for secession in general?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, a Southern secession would not go over well with, it would really raise hackles with a whole bunch of people. Never mind that the South now is very, very different from the South back when. I mean, one of the things about secession in 1861 was the stakes were really pretty high. The stakes are not high right now. Okay. I mean, if there was a secession, either in California or in the South, right, it wouldn't be as if we're going to bring back slavery or discrimination or any of that stuff. The Civil Rights Revolution took hold of. There's no going back on any of that. Won't be anywhere. But nevertheless, it's psychologically a real hurdle. And I'm trying to say, well, we're pretty much there in terms of how divided we are. people do talk about civil war. I don't. We're obviously not going to do that. But secession's a real possibility. Now, part of my story is, most of my life I lived in Canada, and we went through a secession crisis up there. And, it nearly happened, came within a hair's breadth in 1995. And right now it's Alberta that's thinking of getting out of Confederation up in Canada because of the federal government's intrusion on the oil patch. So, it's a real option up there. And like almost every country in the world has got a secession movement. So why do we think we're exceptional?
Yeah, you actually wrote about one that has part of Canada in it that I was not familiar with before. Can you talk about Cascadia and what that is?
Yeah, Cascadia is one of the more weirder examples of this. It's the completely woke people in the western side, the seaboard, the ocean side of Oregon and Washington State and British Columbia, right? And bear in mind, Washington State is, for example, totally divided between the eastern side and the western side. I mean, the ocean side is very liberal. The other side is more like Montana or Idaho. So I don't know if they get off the ground, but that, when you read stories about the craziness in people, places like Portland, yeah, right, mm-hmm, where they tolerate the Antifa violence, right, that just gives you a signal of where they're coming from. I mean, Portland, for example, they allowed Antifa to threaten federal workers, ICE workers, immigration mm-hmm, officers, right, and finally, the federal government had to send in U.S. Marshals to protect its own employees, right? Because the state wasn't going to do it. I mean, frankly, I thought they might have sent in the National Guard at that point. But that's an example of the extreme craziness in the very woke parts of America. And my answer to that would have been that of Horace Greeley in 1861, mm-hmm, erring sisters depart in peace.
Yes, well put. A lot of people will say these days, this is a topic I've brought up many times and I've heard thrown back at me, the right for a state or a land area or however you want to put it, to secede, it doesn't exist in America anymore. That's been taken care of a long time ago. But you describe in the book how it actually could happen through constitutional means. And could you talk about that?
Well, right. I mean, the first question is, if a state seceded, what would the federal government do? And everybody kind of imagines, well, we got the playbook on that one. It's Abraham Lincoln in 1861. But I don't see too many Abraham Lincolns around. I mean, maybe Donald Trump, but if California and its electoral votes wanted out, one possible response from Trump would be, well, don't let the door hurt you on the way out. I mean, if those states secede, if liberal states seceded, a Republican president might count the electoral votes and say that's fine. But in any event, Lincoln's response in calling up the troops was really remarkable. Nobody ever thought that could happen before. Go back. I invite your listeners, go back onto the web and take a look at James Buchanan's Fourth State of the Union message. And here's what he was saying. He was saying, number one, okay, South Carolina, you don't have the right to secede. Number two, South Carolina, you have no reason to secede. And then Buchanan said, well, what am I supposed to do about it? Am I supposed to send in the army? Right? And he quoted James Madison. See, Madison at one point in the Constitutional Convention said, well, if a state's doing stuff we don't like, we can send in the troops. And then Madison said, wait a minute, that's horrible. Mm-hmm. The federal government should never invade a state. Well, when my Alexandria, Virginia was invaded in 1861, it was the federal government that did it. So, I don't see that as happening. I mean, that required a weird conjunction of events. It required some hotheads in Charleston, South Carolina, and it took an extraordinarily tough man in Abraham Lincoln. And I don't see that on the horizon. Let me give you one example of what I'm talking about. I lived in Quebec. Quebec passed anti-English legislation. It was called Bill 101. And the English community in Montreal, Quebec, called it Bill 401. What's 401? It's the highway to Toronto. Today, if there was a secession, U-Haul would be doing a lot of business, but that's about it. We'd sort ourselves out peacefully in those kinds of circumstances. A lot of people from California would move to Texas. I hope the right people, by the way. And that would more or less be that. And what we'd probably end up with at that point was, inevitably, it would be kicked over to the Supreme Court. Okay? And so what would the Supreme Court do? Well, it had this one precedent in 1868 that said you can't secede. But that was kind of the victor's constitution. That was a very political Supreme Court, which didn't want to take on the issue during the war, but when it was good and settled, could rule on it. But if you're an originalist who respects the framers, you'd conclude that there's a right of secession. Why do I say that? Because in the middle of their conference in Philadelphia, 1787, a whole bunch of states threatened to secede. And nobody thought the worst of it. They just thought, okay, well, maybe that'll happen. Okay. I mean, there was some heated discussion, but in general, the right to secede was conceded by the framers. And so up to 1861, pretty much the consensus was there's a right to secede. I mean, there's nothing in the Constitution that flatly either forbids it or permits it, right? Except, the general theory accepted by most people was the Constitution was a compact, and it's like a contract, and you get to walk out from a contract when you think it's being broken.
Yeah, exactly. How do you envision a state seceding and then, I don't know, like all of the federal ties that most states have now? How would something like that work out?
Well, back in 1861, Henry Adams, great grandson of a president, said, it's really easy to secede because there's just so little to the federal government. I mean, nearly all the employees work for the post office. In South Carolina, every federal official resigned and became a state official. Right now, the federal thumbprint is so heavy on the states that it would take a lot of discussion, negotiation to do it. But these things can happen.
Mm-hmm.
So I talked a moment ago about what would happen if sent it up before the Supreme Court. Well, I don't think the court would rule either that there's an absolute right to secede or that we could ignore a secession referendum. I mean, the way I would see it happening is first you have a referendum validated by the legislature of the state, okay? And at that point, and then probably some reference to some decision of a Supreme Court to try to figure it out. The most likely result would be an Article 5 convention, okay, which would have the effect of redesigning federalism to give the states a lot more of their powers back again. And I think that would be the ideal situation, the ideal result to all of this. Because if the problem is where California gets to set laws that bind the rest of us,
right? In
terms of federally enforced laws. Of course, now the left is losing and will completely lose the Supreme Court. Up to now, I mean, these guys are not Democrats; they're anti-Democrats, right? It's the anti-Democratic Party.
Yeah.
They always figure, we'll get our way one way or the other by our control of the media, the liberal control of the media, or, we'll get a state to do what we want. But, down there in Texas, you've got a bunch of very, very liberal district court judges who blocked the president's efforts to enforce our immigration laws, and the Fifth Circuit is overruling those very liberal judges. So, a more conservative circuit court is stopping that. So, what that's going to mean is the left will realize at some point we've lost it. Right? We thought we owned the federal government. We thought we owned the media. I mean, we still will. We thought we owned all that. We thought we owned the law, the courts. We don't have that. And we can't win national elections. There's only one way out. Right? And the only way out is let us go our own way. Okay? And I guess, you see, nobody would want to see an absolute independence. I mean, we wouldn't like to get a passport to visit San Diego. Mm-hmm. And they got the naval base there, right? So these are the sorts of things you got to discuss. But that's how these things get worked out in a constitutional convention. We're not all that far from a constitutional convention. I'm just saying, what if we threw this one into their laps?
Yeah, you've got a great section in the middle of the book, part 2. A Cure for Bigness. And it's important because it kind of shows you as a country where we are size-wise, population-wise, et cetera. And you discuss it with badness, happiness, corruption, and so on. Yep. Can you talk about that section and some of the stuff you found out as you were researching for it?
Yeah, well, I got started there. My research on the framers. I teach a course on the framers. It's probably the only course in any law school in America where we actually read what the framers were talking about. We read their debates. There was an extended debate about the optimal size of a government. Too big, too small, whatever. And that was 1787, and that was largely a matter of, prediction about things they knew nothing about. I mean, nobody could have anticipated where we'd end up now, right? With a geographically and in terms of population, a huge country run from the center, run from Washington. And that's just unstable. I mean, I don't compare us to the Soviet Union, but they went through a breakup and it was similar. They were too darn big. There are a lot of countries that were just uneasily yoked, like Czechoslovakia, or too big, that went through a secession crisis. And we're primed for it because, when you think of some of the things you might not like about America, one of them is the swamp, by which I mean corruption at the federal level. All right? And that's a function of bigness. I mean, it's a function of bigness because the further the center is from the periphery, the further the center is from ordinary citizens across the country, the more you can get away with. It's harder to get away with it locally, generally. So, yes, so less corruption in a smaller country, more freedom in a smaller country. I'm not just making this up. I mean, what I did is hey, we do number crunching at my law school. So I looked at a list of, 100, 130 odd countries, and I just said, well, in terms of things like freedom, who wins? And the smaller countries are freer countries. I mean, we tend to be the big exception in all of this stuff, in the sense that, we're more or less free, right? We're rich. And so we stick out like a sore thumb. It's the other big countries that seem to bear more of the brunt of bigness. But we're getting to the point where it's become unstable. So we have to ask ourselves those kinds of questions. By the way, one difference that does affect us, I think, has to do with the military. I mean, we've got the strongest military in the world, but at the same time, I think we've intervened too much and foolishly in some cases. And that's not something smaller countries do. It's like when you get big, you get a tendency to throw your weight around more. So the biggest countries in the world are countries with big militaries that try to dominate their neighbors. And, we've done that. Smaller countries would do less of that. And maybe that'd be a turn for the better in the case of America. Right? There wouldn't have been a second Gulf War, for example.
Right.
So, I'm completely supportive of what the president did in taking out that Iranian madman a couple of days back. So, our force has been a force for good. I'm not suggesting the alternative, but sometimes it's been maybe a force for too much good. Like we didn't have to do all those wars, and which didn't always turn out very well. So there is that. What would give people pause, importantly, would not be so much the military. By the way, if you take away military spending, or California's contribution to military spending, it could entirely fund a state national health.
Right.
So so if you gave Californians that choice, that I think they'd be tempted.
Yeah. All of a sudden, states' rights might look like an attractive thing.
Yeah.
For progressives in California.
Yeah, they can be. They want to be more progressive. Fine.
Right.
But if you ask, so just think of an ordinary person being posed the question, and you ask yourself, why might he oppose secession? Well, if you're conservative, you're kind of, you respect your country's heritage, and you don't like the idea of it being ignored, ripped apart. The only thing is that's happening already, right? In state after state, the statutes are coming down, for example. And in the universities, they're trying to denigrate anything that's good about our history. So that's happening already, right? I mean, I'm sure it's happening at at UT.
Yes, it actually is. Yeah.
So that's happening already. What else is there? Well, like I say, we don't want a passport to go to, California. So you'd want to have something like free movement of goods and people. But that's just by way of saying you'd like to have a customs union, like they do in Europe.
Right.
The EU.
Right.
So maybe you'd be satisfied with that. I mean, how would that bargain strike you? I mean, you get free movement of goods and people across the United States, but you also get to opt out of federal laws you don't like, right?
Yeah.
I mean, to me, that seems like win-win.
Yeah. As a nation now, as you were just getting at, as far as discourse goes, there's a section you discuss superbly, exit versus voice.
Yeah.
Can you talk about exit versus voice, that option, and kind of where we really are right now when it comes to that?
Yeah, that's kind of a classic economic distinction. Here's the argument. You don't like the way things are going, right? In a relationship, in a constitution. One of your options is just leave the relationship, which would be secession. Another option is called voice, and what that means is staying in and voicing your objections to things that are wrong. For most of American history, that's worked relatively well, with the exception of 1861, right? But the voice option doesn't work when we're completely in gridlock. I mean, we're at a point where the left won't be able to get what it wants nationally, and the right won't be able to get what it wants nationally, unless they lower their stakes and say, well, let's just do it statewide and not federal-wide. Let's not have the feds try to dictate for the rest of the country. The only reason the left hasn't thought about this already is the left's figure it controls the country.
Yeah.
I mean, they're triumphalist. I mean, they really think. I mean, I'm in near Washington, across the river. And every day I pick up the Washington Post, and it's an argument for secession.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the contempt for ordinary common sense thinking is bewildering.
Yeah.
I mean, your hate, if you say there are just two genders, that's hateful.
Right.
I mean, this is like what every scientist, what every American really believes, and all of a sudden you're turned into a figure of hate, right? So what the left will do is it'll invite new ways of finding ordinary people despicable, deplorable. The right, the wrong hand signal. We never knew there was a problem, but they'll just discover things. It's like they're picking at scabs. And what's behind it is, of course, an opportunity to exult in a justified sense of hatred. I mean, that's one of the most delicious of human feelings, which is, a sign of how we're all fallen humanity, right? And just they just give that free rein. So what happens when they figure they can't get away with that, right? At that point, maybe everybody should lower their stakes a little bit and let California go its own way and let Texas go its own way. And that's, that means opting out of rule from Washington.
Yeah. I want to talk about home rule real quick, too, because you do go into a few ways that as a country, we could make giant leaps forward and still avoid secession. And one of those is home rule. And I have a follow-up on this because we'll see how possible this is in your mind, at least. But talk about home rule real quick.
Yeah. First of all, before we get there, if people are totally opposed to the idea of secession, they might ask themselves, on which side were they in 1776? If
Right.
That was secession.
Yes.
And then a couple of years later, the Brits, who were fairly sensible, apart from a bullheaded king, and wanted to put an end to it, sent a commission over here. And what they offered was essentially home rule. And what it came down to is, look, Americans, we get it. You don't like us. We get it. Right? It was sort of an anti-Sally Fields moment. But here's the deal. We're going to give you everything you want except for one thing. You keep the connection to the British Crown. But that's 1778. But at that point, the Americans had figured, we don't need that, right? And so they rejected it. And but that idea of self-government with a figurehead allegiance to a higher state became home rule when the Brits proposed it for Ireland in the 1880s. Right? It was the basis for a lot of compromises between the Brits and the Irish at that time. And actually, it was a Canadian solution. I mean, actually, it was what happened when Britain yielded control to all of its former colonies. Right? What it said is, okay, you guys get to do whatever you want, but for maybe emotional reasons, you're going to keep your connection to the crown. So, but then, apart from that, you can run your own country. So home rule in an American context would be a little bit like that. It would be something like, well, you get to set your own taxes, right? What remains of the federal government, remains to be seen. It's a matter of negotiation. In various forms of home rule, there were things like free movement of goods and people, right? There was foreign policy, money still vested in the national government. There are a number of things like that to be worked out. I mean, Texas might want to say, look, we don't exactly want to follow the Supreme Court on some of its rulings, but we're not going to go to war with Mexico, right? We're not going to have our own foreign policy. So those are kind of those. There's a lengthy constitutional history of those kinds of arrangements, and they all make sense. So there are things that are important to Texans and things that are not important to Texans. So one thing that might be important to Texans or South Carolinians or whatever, or Californians, would be gay rights, right? So maybe you don't want to have same-sex marriages. Or maybe if you're in California, you want to go hog wild on transgender rights, whatever it is. But there are those kinds of differences.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a matter, I think, for the state to decide which way it wants to go. And, if you're, like I say, if you're on the wrong side of that one, you have what in Canada was called the 401 option, or what I call the U-Haul option. Move to a state where you like the laws better.
Right.
We're all pretty mobile people.
Yeah.
When you get down to it. I mean, 4/10 of Americans live in a state other than the one they were born in. That doesn't include, by the way, the immigrants. And so which takes it way over 50 or 60%. And we tend to end up in states where, you feel comfortable. Doesn't always work. I mean,
right.
I thought I was moving to a conservative state when I came to Virginia.
Right.
Silly me.
Well, the home rule sounds to you and I like, well, that's pretty much common sense. Who would disagree with it at this point? Why would California care what South Carolina does or Alabama?
The left, I think the right would be perfectly happy with it.
Yes, you're about to get to the point I was going to make. Go ahead.
Okay, the left at this point would not. Why?
Right.
Because they still think they rule the roost.
Yes.
I mean, they're in their own bubble, and they listen to CNN or MSNBC, and they read their ultra-liberal newspapers, and they're cocooned in their own world, except they got the rudest of awakenings in 2016. Look, I don't know about you, but there's sort of an election eve porn thing where on YouTube you look at the faces of liberal commentators collapse over the course of the election evening. A lot of fun, I got to tell you.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, they still haven't figured it out. They doubled down. Okay, if you guys have problems with same-sex marriage, we're going to have drag queen story hour.
Yes.
Okay. So, we don't give up. Except at some point, they're going to figure out they lost it. So at that point, everybody will start thinking about this.
Yeah, I was going to say it spoke volumes when I believe it was Alabama and Georgia had some abortion laws that basically just banned abortion after a certain time frame, if I'm correct.
Yep.
And California lost their minds. And I thought, why would you care about what goes on across the entire country with abortion?
Yep.
And
I know.
Yeah.
Exactly. Except that they're imperialists when you get down to it. They're liberal imperialists. They want to force their ideology on the rest of us. I guess that's what drag queen story hours are all about. It's about offending people. It's not about celebrating anybody. It's about offending people. It's not about showing love. It's about showing hatred for your enemy. And just think about the progression. I mean, we went from gay marriages to transgender rights in the blink of an eye. It's like as soon as they won one victory, they'd set their sights on a higher hill. And I think they've completely overplayed their hand. I think the likelihood of Trump getting reelected is real high at this point.
As do I, because of the left essentially doubling down on the reasons they lost in the first place.
Yep.
Instead of taking a look in the mirror and saying, okay, maybe we should have listened to middle America or the quote unquote deplorables. Why did this happen? This is not in the game plan for us. They basically said it had to be cheating. He had to be in bed with Vladimir Putin. That's what this was. It couldn't have been us. Yeah. And then take the country on a 2 or 3 year joke of an investigation.
They've so much hurt our country. We could have had the opportunity of a sensible deal with Russia.
Yes.
And now we've got Russia and China linked together opposing us. We could have won Russia over. in the course of which Russia would have been required to abandon all its bad behavior. I mean, we didn't have to go through any of this stuff. We got it in part because of the Democrats' indifference to the best interests of the United States. You know, as well, by the way, of a long history of pusillanimous foreign policy conduct,
yes,
where we just gave things away. So, you know, yeah, I can see how the left at this point might realize we're not going to get our way.
Yeah.
I don't know why the Californians objected to the people in Alabama, except that it's a kind of existential threat. You know, we're imperialists. We require that everyone agree with us.
Yeah.
And you know, that to me is the problem. By the way, I mean, you know, that was in part the problem in 1861, according to James Buchanan. But James Buchanan was a racist, as everybody was at the time. And now the stakes are a lot lower.
Yeah.
You know, if you want to fight a battle over slavery, okay, I completely get that. You want to fight a war over transgender bathrooms? I mean, you know, or drag queen story hours? I mean, how crazy is that?
Yeah, well put. Well, we've chatted a lot about Secession and your book, which again, excellent book, and I highly recommend it to you guys listening. So let me ask you this, Frank. Do you see secession happening within the next few decades here?
I think it's very likely we're going to have a pro-secession movement grow up. I think that it'll come from the left when they realize they don't own America anymore. That's why I wrote American Secession, the book. And, you know, making predictions about the future, it's kind of a mug's game. I'm just saying the trajectory right now is towards a complete revulsion of a liberal-dominated America. And, you know, two things I think are going to happen. Two possibilities, you tell me. One possibility is common sense will return in the form of a series of Republican administrations, and the left will accept this. Or the left won't accept it. So the impetus would come from the left, as I see it.
Yeah.
To secede.
I'm going to go with option 2 on that one, by the way.
Yeah, I think it's more likely. So, like I say, erring sisters depart in peace.
Bingo. Yeah, exactly. This has been a great chat about secession in your new book. Before we go, tell my listeners where they can find you online, any of your writings and all of that stuff for you.
Well, I've been writing for a variety of places, Wall Street Journal, New York Post, and you can find me. I don't keep up a blog, but you can link me on Facebook, and the book is American Secession. You can get it off Amazon.
Excellent. I will provide all of those links in the show notes page for this episode. Mr. Buckley, thank you so much for being here on Death to Tyrants.
Oh, thank you so much. Great talking to a Texan.
Yeah, thank you, sir.
Take care, man.
All right, you guys, that was very good. I love talking about secession, and I urge you guys to get that discussion out there amongst the social groups you're in and see what they think. And again, of course, like I said, buy this book. It's really good and a really easy read, and you will enjoy it, I predict. So let me tell you something real quick. If you were thinking about joining the Libertarian Party and you were turned off, as I was for the last several years, jump back into it. And to do so, we've got a link here at Death to Tyrants. I want you to show the LP that you guys, the hardcore people, are going to jump in and change the party as we know it. To do that, go to www.lp.org/Death to Tyrants, and you will see a special welcome for the listeners of this show. Where to find me online, you guys already know this, but in case you're new, facebook.com/Death to Tyrants podcast. Follow me on Twitter @BuckRebel, BuckRebel. You can donate to the show if you'd like. Patreon.com/Death to Tyrants. I think that just about takes care of all of the business for this week. Thank you once again to F.H. Buckley for being here. I've loved talking about secession. Until next week, y'all have a good one.
Get split in fucking half, till I call him the hologram wrath. But I am the center inside the placenta of math. You clash with cyanide gas and die fast. Rhythmical equivalent of solids, liquid and gas. We smash your sinus with the power of Lord Titus. But I am the virus inside of the iris of Cyrus.
Like the sound of the Death to Tyrants podcast? Our audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.